was a famine that, after the end of World War II, spread across large parts of Eastern Europe, notably the former Soviet republics, including Ukraine and Moldova. The Soviet famine 80 years ago, the last famine in Soviet history. Some estimates as high as 2 million died, with the highest proportion of the population, that is 150,000 people, in Moldova. Hundreds of thousands more affected by severe malnutrition and disease, many of them children. The cause? Well, of course, the ramifications of the end of World War II, and also a bad drought. But there's growing evidence as well that perhaps an equal cause came directly from the Soviet authorities. Historians delving into the archives, pointing to the regime's grain requisitions. In many villages, the quotas were so high that people were not even allowed to keep enough grain to survive themselves. Well, 80 years on, those who either remember what happened themselves or have heard the stories from their families continue to suffer collective trauma. In a country still torn between its Soviet legacy and its aspirations to join Europe, the need to remember the anniversary is essential to those wishing to counter any nostalgic narratives of the USSR. Many people working together to piece together the scale of the tragedy, considered by many to be the Moldovan Holodomor. Gerth, Niculescu and Bastien Renouil revisit Moldova for France 24.
Ochii mari, bubucați, pânticele mari, dar piciorușele slabi, subțiri. Casele erau pline cu morți. Cel care vrea să iasă din casă, să salveze cât de cât, îl apuca moartea în drum.
Ca să vezi cum o mamă tânără moare în ochii tăi și copchelașul ei de 5-6 lunișoare, cum moare și el sugând din sânul ei rece. Ceva...
The Soviet Moldovan famine of 1946 left more than 150,000 people dead. About 10% of the population at the time. These scenes are recreated by actors, with few real survivors still able to testify. Nina Dandara was 5 years old in 1946.
We had a cow and people would come with a cup or a small bowl, and my mother would give them a little milk. They would beg. One had a mother who was dying, another a child, a son or a daughter. We fed the cow thistles. There were only 2 cows left, ours and the one used to carry the dead. She was so thin. I can still see it today, speckled with white and red.
It is early spring. The ground is finally thawing after months of bitter cold. Winter brings back the trauma. During the famine, it was the harshest season.
I will never be able to forget that time. It brings tears to my eyes just thinking of it. A family lived in a house down the hill. The father's name was Kirill, and he had an 8-year-old son. The little boy died, and his parents ate him. The rest of us children, when we found out, ate everything we were given so we wouldn't die, so we wouldn't be eaten ourselves.
This tragic episode in Moldovan history is little known. The famine was long considered a taboo subject, then presented as a consequence of the post-war period and drought. However, research shows that the population was deliberately starved by the Soviet authorities. Today, Larissa Toria visits Nina. She has been investigating the famine since the 1980s.
People had reserves, so how did they end up with nothing?
It wasn't the drought that caused the famine, it was the Russians. They took whatever we had in our attics. They came in a big lorry, I can still picture it. And on top were sacks they'd taken from other houses. They opened the door and went up to the loft and kept coming back down with the beans and everything else.
Formerly Romanian, Moldova was incorporated into the Soviet Union after the end of the Second World War.
Here is the book I spent 40 years writing about the famine. I tried to gather as much documentation as possible. Some people said that nobody knew about it, that Stalin didn't know what was happening here, but that isn't true. I found lots of letters. When the policy of what they called the liberation of our region of Moldova was implemented, Stalin is said to have wanted to deport the entire Romanian-speaking population. But as such a deportation would have been very costly, this orchestrated famine was a far cheaper option. One of the witnesses I spoke to described the area to me as a concentration camp without gas chambers.
For her research, Larissa travels the length of the country in search of a truth that has haunted her since her teenage years.
It was only after I'd grown up that I learnt the woman who looked after me, who had held me in her arms, was a poor soul who had eaten her dead daughter during the famine. I couldn't understand it. In public, nobody spoke of the famine. The word was strictly forbidden. That really spurred me on to understand how it all came about. I'm piecing together a jigsaw puzzle from which a piece, a detail, is still missing. I would like this picture to be as complete as possible.
Moldova was regarded as an important arming region for the USSR. No one could have imagined a famine there.
In Moldova, the fields stretch as far as the eye can see. They say it's a country where the sun always shines. And here we see fields of cereal, wheat, rye, barley, oats.
Yet it was the rural areas that suffered the most from the famine. Food requisitions combined with forced labour on collective farms enabled the communist authorities to finance the post-war period.
This confiscation of foodstuffs had specific objectives: to replenish the state's grain reserves in order to support the army and all Soviet civil servants, but also for export. In 1946 to 1947, the Soviet Union exported thousands of tons of grain to assist the communist parties in Eastern and Western European countries, including France.
Gagauzia in the south of the country was one of the hardest hit regions. In some places, 80% of the population died of starvation. It is a trauma that their descendants still carry with them, such as Ignat Kazmali, who has devoted 15 years of his life to this museum dedicated to the history of his village.
Here is the older brother of my maternal grandmother, Ekaterina Diomida. And this is my paternal grandmother's older brother.
Through these archives, he aims to make the truth accessible to the general public. But many documents remain classified.
There are people today who were once ardent supporters of the socialist system and Bolshevik ideology, who held positions within the political establishment, and who now claim that none of this ever happened. Here are 16 documents which clearly state the cause of death was dystrophy and dyspepsia. Dystrophy refers to exhaustion and malnutrition.
In Gagauzia, a large portion of the population is now pro-Russian in a country that is politically divided, particularly over membership of the European Union. Soviet propaganda remains effective, including regarding the famine.
I don't think the Soviet authorities took this food themselves. I don't know who did it. What I do know is that many people died.
Back in Soviet times, we had everything. Children went to school, people went to hospital, everything was free. We received free medical treatment, medicines were free, everything was fine. We loved the Soviet Union, and we still do. I would even accept a union with Russia.
This nostalgia is fueled by parties aligned with Moscow, which mainly targets the older generations. Despite this rhetoric, Ignac's work is gradually changing attitudes in his village. In his presence, these women adopt a more moderate tone.
There was a drought, no rain. That's why there was a famine.
Perhaps if the Soviet Union hadn't taken people's grain, they might have been able to keep their reserves.
A few meters away, Ignat had a memorial built. Most of the famine victims were thrown into mass graves. The few survivors were too weak to bury their loved ones.
They say that children suffered the most. And here is the proof. There are 23 names on this plaque. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 children. Standing here today at this memorial, before the names of the famine victims and reflecting on the past, helps us to understand the scale of the atrocities committed by the authorities against the local population.
In the capital, Chisinau, there is currently no monument dedicated to the famine. The act of remembrance has found other avenues. To reach a young, urban audience, Larissa Tria's book has been adapted into a play.
I believe the play goes far beyond the book, precisely because of the way it distills the essence of the story and conveys this ocean of suffering. It hits the mark, and the intended audience is reached. It's a tragedy that must be remembered, that must be discussed in order to raise a free generation. One cannot be free when one is dependent on a crust of bread.
Aproape în întregime s-o stâns familia lui Vasile Paciu. O scăpat numai fiica Ana. Țin minte cum tatăl lor își ducea în spate, într-un sac, una câte una, fiicele la cimitir. Se opre la poarta noastră, sleit de puteri, își pune sacul pe un pietroi mare, își trăge sufletul, apoi își lua povara în spate și îți duce mai departe. Tare mulți au murit.
Unic mătușa Paraschiva nu l-a îngropat pe Ilie, dar îl ține ascuns pe cuptor. Tai din el câte o bucată și mănânc. Ne-am dus să vedem ce am văzut acolo, n-am să uit în vecii vecilor. O bună parte din trupul lui Ilie nu mai era. Dar în casă pluteau aburi cu miros de carne de om fiar.
For over 2 years, the piece is regularly played to a full house, proof of the Moldovans' need to learn about their history.
Și de-aia mi se pare important acest spectacol. Pentru ca tânăra generație să știe.
That's why I think this production is important.
Să evite lucruri de genul, adică
so that young people are aware of these issues.
Să accepte un dictator.
And in the future avoid accepting a dictator.
Să aibă dreptul la liberă exprimare.
And develop a clear sense of right and wrong.
Clar între ce e bine și ce e rău.
What I'm saying is utopian, but that's what I'd like to see. For people to acknowledge the crimes of the past, because that is what divides us today.
Divisions which do not prevent Moldova from focusing on the future. The country is in the midst of the process of joining the European Union, a move that is not universally welcomed, but which could mark a definitive break with its Soviet past.